Yo, something's going down between some cops and some dude.
Sir, I need you to drop the knife. Drop the knife. Drop the knife. Drop the knife. Drop it.
Well, someone's going down with some cop.
I'm gonna take you, I'm gonna take myself.
Sir, drop the knife. Don't come in closer.
After viewing two very different scenarios with two very different outcomes, we saw one where the subject was actually ended up being detained and subdued, and one where the subject was actually killed while using a firearm. Now, tasers are marketed as a non-lethal, less lethal alternative for controlling combative or uncooperative suspects. Now, tasers aren't always do exactly what they say, as there's the rare chance that they could cause a potentially disruption in the heart rhythm of the subject when used. Now, tasers are given out to most police services across North America, and they're used in their day-to-day work. When tasers fire their barbed darts, they attach themselves to the skin or the clothing of the suspect when fired, and they release a neuromuscular response that paralyzes the subject for several seconds. This allows police officers to come in with handcuffs and arrest them within that window. Most tasers only fire about one dart, but there are some, according to the model, and they could fire 2 to 3. Tasers also have a stun gun variant inside, attached to the taser, so there's 2 modes to it. It works much like your conventional stun gun, where you press it up against someone's body, you press the button, and it releases a jolt of pain, which allows the police officer to come and arrest them and handcuff them. Now, tasers usually fire around 15 to 25 feet when they're fired from the weapon. And after that, the range is not really that effective. Tasers also cost around roughly $850 to maybe $1,500, but this is all varies to like the quantity and the different types of models there are. Now, tasers are an effective weapon to be used for police officers, and they are potentially a life-saving weapon. I'm now going to pass it off to Kyle to talk about the legal procedures that go with tasers.
Hi, my name is Kyle Burton, and for this assignment, I'm going to be covering the legal procedures revolving around conducted energy weapons in the police services, and these weapons are usually more commonly known as tasers. So, to begin, there are currently no ministry requirements for the police to have any procedures or policies in regards to conducted energy weapons. 91% of police services state that their police chief has set conducted energy weapon procedures, and 48% state that there's already a board policy in place. So basically what this is showing, that even though there's no formal law put forward by the government to govern the use of tasers in the police force and where they should be used and how they should be used, police services take the initiative and put forward a guideline so that all officers can have a reference of how they should make use of their tasers, the situations they can use them in, and where they should be using them. So to continue, the majority of stakeholders support a transition that allows all primary response officers to carry a conducted energy weapon. Many officers argue that since they are all issued a more lethal weapon, and that weapon being a firearm, they should also be given a less lethal weapon, and that weapon being a taser or conducted energy weapon. And in 2008, a report by the OACP, and the OACP being the Ontario Association of Police Chiefs, or of Chief of Police, they state that restrictions may impact police ability to safely handle situations that have the potential to escalate. So what this section is basically saying is that there are many supporters of responding officers being able to carry these conducted energy weapons. They argue saying that if all officers are capable and are required to bear a lethal weapon and to use it if the situation demands it, why can't they use a more less lethal weapon such as a taser to minimize casualties or injuries and better handle a situation without having a potential death at the scene? And that's also supported by the OACP, which is basically a board of police chiefs that, the incorporation of more tasers, taser use by responding officers could better handle escalating situations rather than resorting directly to the use of a firearm. So to continue, police forces offer various types of CEW training. Officers also receive annual training that covers a number of fields. These fields include instructor, user training, refresher, and familiarization. And the police service also makes a case to review other topics, such as legislation revolving around conducted energy weapons, or CEWs, or tasers. So this little section is basically outlining that police services, they don't just put tasers in the hands of officers without giving them a crash course on how to use them. It's important to not be ignorant on how to use these tools, even though they are less lethal than a firearm. They still can cause harm, and they want to make sure that they are in the hands of trained professionals. With that being said, the police services offer training, and here it says they offer annual training to their officers in a number of fields. For the instructor field, it would basically be teaching an officer how to use it in a way that they can teach other officers how to use it. There's also user training, and this is more of the general course on how to use the tasers. This is basically for officers that are going to be out on active duty and would have a taser on them. So that's the user training. For the refresher is exactly as it sounds. It's basically just a refresher of how to use this tool. And familiarization is just a course on how to use, basically where everything is on the taser, what settings do what, and all the different compartments and parts. And in addition to that, it states that police also give a course on the legislation, which is also important because aside from the usage, police officers should also know what laws revolve around it. Even though there are no laws for police services to put up guidelines, there are still laws around the general use of tasers. So it's great that the police services offer a legislation course.
So when it comes to positive aspect of taser use regarding police legitimacy, tasers have the benefit of not only subduing a suspect immediately, but effectively, meaning that tasers remove potential harm done to both the officer and the perpetrator. It also removes any lethal harm done to the suspect because tasers are non-lethal weapons. Combative situations are never simple, easy, or both, because the situation regarding reasonable force is always questionable. Reasonable force used by the taser depends on the officer, not the taser itself, but it is a better alternative in lethal situations so no casualties occur whatsoever. Firearms are lethal weapons and are generally used as a last resort to put an immediate end to a suspect that uses such deadly force. Tasers usually put an immediate end to the suspect without resulting in death. Therefore, using tasers would end with the same result with less means. Death by cop has always existed in society. When a person chooses to end their life by forcing an officer to execute them due to reasonable belief that the suspect wishes to harm the officer, tasers prevent this outcome, and the perpetrator can later be taken in for closer examination to any psychological effects they may have. Tasers also can shoot at a range of up to 10 meters, which is a safe distance from the perpetrator to avoid harm when subduing him. Not only does taser use prevent deaths, but also reduces the public hatred toward the police for using lethal force that may lead the media to post the incident as misconduct, as well as reducing the number of cases the SIU need to investigate, because SIU investigates death cases, or cases involving death. So we talked about the positive aspects of taser use. However, On a negative perspective towards taser use, tasers are very ineffective towards the mentally ill because it serves as a quick and sort of lazy solution to diffusing a situation. Communication is best used for mental health persons. As said before, taser use depends solely on the officer, and the wrong officer may use it excessively, similar to firearm or baton use. Usually, tasers have no means of lethal harm. However, an electric shock that powerful can possibly lead to death for persons with damaged hearts, for example. It is up to the officer to use tasers with discretion rather than their itchy trigger fingers. So overall, inappropriate taser use can lead to riots, distrust in the police itself, and more. However, it is a better alternative than firearms because it removes lethal harm almost entirely. The public needs to trust the police will use tasers discreetly and only punish officers who excessively use the power and not the agency itself.
Good morning, class. This is Daniel Mercieca, and I'm here to talk about taser usage. More specifically, the taser court cases and taser court history. So, as we know, taser usage is a less lethal force given to police services around the world. They're used as an option for police officers when it's in situations where less lethal forces are permitted to be used. But the thing we don't always know is that sometimes tasers can be just as lethal as firearms. So I'd like to discuss our first court case, which would be the case of Robert Dzyński. So Robert Dzyński was a Polish immigrant who went to the Vancouver International Airport on October 13th, 2007. Mr. Dzyński spent a total of 9 hours at this airport, spent some of which wandering around the airport looking for his mother. Robert Dzyński didn't speak the language. He spoke full Polish with no English. Robert Dzyński was found wandering the airport and doing his own thing, but more importantly, he was found in an area where he was not allowed to, so he was escorted outside of that area. Mr. Dzyński then became verbally agitated, physically agitated. This is when the officials in the airport decided to call the RCMP to intervene and detain Mr. Dzyński. Mr. Dzyński was eventually detained and thrown on the floor, and he was eventually tasered a total of 5 times by the RCMP. Mr. Dzyński would actually die minutes later after being tasered a total of 5 times, and this event would actually be recorded heavily by bystanders at the airport and would be circulated through Canadian news media quite heavily and for quite some time, actually. And this is where reports, investigations were done on the use of force there, and it was eventually found that the RCMP officers acted irrationally, and some of them were actually charged. But the ramifications that are brought on by Robert Dzyński were actually quite major because it appears that taser use has actually went on the decline in British Columbia. It was declined by exactly 87% in 5 years following Mr. Dzyński's death. This just goes to show that sometimes taser usage is not always like a less lethal use of force option for police officers. Police officers have used it on plenty of things. They've used it on children. They've used it on pregnant women. They've used it on elderly people. It's still a lethal force that can be used and abused by police officers, and it should be treated as such. Looking at another case of taser usage used by a police service was to be found in Salinas, California, on February 20th of 2005. A taser was used against Mr. Robert Heston Jr. Robert Heston Jr. was a man who has had a long history of drug use. At the time of his arrest and detention, he was found to be on methamphetamine. Robert Heston was reported to be very agitated in public, very wandering around, and the police was eventually called on him. Robert Heston Jr. was found by police officers and was tased a total of 30 times by police officers when they were trying to subdue him. And Robert Heston would eventually die the next day due to an enlarged heart, the methamphetamine intoxication, and the taser shocks that were added on top of that. The reason why this case is so significant is because this is actually the first time a family was able to sue and actually get compensatory damages from a taser company itself. This is actually it was considered a landmark decision in the United States. The company that was sued was called Taser International, and this is the first time their product has been responsible responsible for an injury or death, and this is actually a major thing. The family was awarded $6 million in damages, and their basis was that the company should have been able to warn the police services that were using their taser that this taser could be potentially dangerous and lethal against individuals that were high on drugs or on an effect called excited delirium. They should have been able to effectively warn the police services that this is a lethal use of force, not a non-lethal use of force. Moving away from the grim and grievous deaths that we talked about previously with taser usage, let's move to a more positive light with the weapon. You see, the weapon also has life-saving potential. What do I mean by that? Well, the weapon can be used to subdue suspects who are a danger to themselves, really. Let's look at the example of Namino, British Columbia. In Namino, British Columbia, the police service there encountered an individual who was found outside of a motel that was uttering remarks where he says he wants to die, he doesn't like this earth anymore, and began slashing his wrists. This man was walking down the street slashing his wrists and eventually lost a large quantity of blood. The responding officer eventually tasered the man who had a knife and was slashing his wrists, and eventually ended up saving his life. The officer who did this reasonably thought that this was the only way to save the man's life and to save the public around him. This just goes to show that a taser doesn't only have to be used for, a suspect who's a danger to others. It could be used for suspects who are a danger to themselves, really. This taser effectively saved this man's life, and without it, how else could the officer have subdued the suspect? It was a life-saving device that, it worked perfectly in this situation.
Hi, my name is Jackie. I'm going to talk about taser recommendations. When the taser first came out into the hands of the police, there were many officers confused because they didn't know when or who to use it on and how the taser even worked. The House of Commons issued a few recommendations for the RCMP, but these can also be used for all police services. Out of all of the recommendations, there were 3 main points. There were training, guidelines, and more tasers for all the officers in the force so they can have more options when they're deciding what to do in a situation. First, let's talk about guidelines. When the taser first came out, the officers were confused about when to use the taser. That is why one of the recommendations that the House of Commons offered was to have a strict and clear guideline for taser use in the police service. This will erase the confusion among officers and will increase the effectiveness of tasers overall. Next is training. There are multiple training recommendations that the House of Commons suggested for the RCMP. One of the is to have police officers gain knowledge of how tasers work and the effects it has on the human body. If officers know this information, then the risk of injuries or death will significantly decrease because they know the dangers of the tasers and who not to use it on. Officers should also have a certification for taser use, just like how they have one for firearms, and that they have to pass it and recertify every 2 years. Lastly, for training, they suggested that the service increase their mental health training to all officers because the police officers were having difficulties recognizing if the person was having a mental health episode or was actually trying to cause harm. If they can identify the mental illness or addiction, they can avoid using any kind of force if they don't have to use it. The House of Commons also recommends that the police service use any kind of psychiatric support staff that they have when available so they can help discover if they have any mental health issues or not in a situation. Lastly, the last recommendation is to issue all tasers to all police officers in the service. This will help them get more options in the situation instead of resorting to lethal force because they ran out of options. But for this recommendation, there was a weakness because of funding issues. Police services are always tight on budget, and issuing tasers to all police officers is very difficult and almost impossible. Therefore, this will take a few years to get because of the funding issues that they have.
To conclude everything we've been talking about, we could say that tasers are truly a life-saving weapon, but they do also carry that risk of serious bodily harm or death. And it's tough to say when this will ever happen, when tasers be implemented to every police force, because this is not something that could happen tomorrow, 1 week, 2 weeks. This is something that's going to take years and years and years to be built, to get the public's trust and the government's permission to do this. Tasers itself they've proven themselves to be an effective weapon, but they've also proven themselves to be dangerous when used on individuals suffering from mental health, drug use, and these are problems that the police service will eventually have to overcome and work around. But this is our presentation. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.